Today, we are going to be joined by our wonderful speaker in just a few moments. I'm going to cover a few quick details for you just to get you comfortable for the day, and then we'll dive right in. We're going to be together till about 5 p.m. Central Time, so please adjust. I'm going to talk in Central Time. Please adjust your time accordingly. We'll put the full schedule as far as what to expect with breaks and lunch and all of that in the chat, so be sure to check that out. There are a bunch of us here on the screen today excited to hear from Dr. Ramani. So for that reason, we'll have to have cameras and mics off, but I am here to be your surrogate of sorts and help you interact with Dr. Ramani. So if you have questions that you want answered, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. I'll ask them if at all possible. We'll take several breaks throughout for some Q&A. So go ahead and put them in there. You can also upvote for ones that you see that you would like to have more answers or to see answered as well. Tech, as always, is imperfect, so bear with us. We'll have some information on our FAQ page on the portal, so check that out. Also, we're joined by our web producer, Maddie, who's going to be putting some information in the chat related to tech if anything comes up that she wants to let everybody know about. All right, I guess moving forward, I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Ramani Durvasula. I'll give you a quick background on her, although I imagine many of you are familiar. She's a licensed clinical psychologist in good start, in Los Angeles, California, professor emerita of psychology at Cal State, LA, and founder and CEO of Luna Education, Training and Consulting. She's an author of a number of books, including her most latest that is about to come out, It's Not You, Identifying and Healing from Narcissistic People. Her work has been featured on a number of talk shows, South by Southwest, TEDx, you name it. She also has a strong social media presence at Dr. Ramani, and also her podcast, Navigating Narcissism with Dr. Ramani. You've probably seen her. She also has a new certification with us that teaches you everything you need to know about working with narcissistic abuse. That has just come out. It's a big 36-hour, everything you would want to know kind of training. So this woman knows what she's talking about. So I'm going to stop talking and welcome Dr. Ramani Durvasula and turn the microphone over to her. So welcome, Dr. Ramani.
Thank you. Oh, there you go. Thank you so much, Anna. Good morning. Very early morning here on the West Coast for anyone joining us, and normal morning time for the rest of you. And I'm such a stickler for timings. Any of you know that I've always got these little timers going off that'll buzz on my wrist. So as I'm yammering on about any of this, we are good to go. There we go. So welcome to this program. It has been such a privilege to create this, but even more so to constantly be adding to it. So it's current, so it's relevant, so it's based on other things that are coming up. So I really do try to keep this as sort of, plugged into the current state of theory and science. So again, welcome and thank you for your interest in this, which I think is actually one of the more important emerging areas of clinical practice. So what we're going to be talking today is sort of the fallout. What happens to people when they have experienced a narcissistic or antagonistic relationship? You're going to see me going back and forth between this language of narcissistic abuse, antagonistic relational stress, because that's a lot of words to get out of my mouth. I'll sometimes stay with narcissistic abuse. But again, this whole idea that it's not just about the narcissism of it all and getting caught in those weeds. It's this general sense of antagonistic patterns, which is why I call this work antagonism-informed work, in the sense that you're informed by how antagonistic personalities and patterns and traits show up in relational spaces, and then subsequently how they affect another person. So I just wanted to kind of give you that orientation. So let's start with a case, which is where I think it's always best for all of us to kind of do what we do best. And so this is a case, as always, these cases represent real people where the case has been morphed enough ways that there's no way to identify the individual, but these themes did arise out of actual clinical practice. And in this particular case, Marisol is 60, she's Latina. She grew up with a narcissistic mother who was physically abusive and would abandon the children for days at a time while she pursued relationships with men or ran her business. Marisol was the eldest of the siblings, and she warned her siblings to never say anything, otherwise they'd be separated and separated up and sent to live with separate foster families. From an early age, Marisol stepped up, cared for her siblings, learned to never speak out against her mother out of fear, and regularly heard how her biological father was a terrible man who didn't love her, and Marisol is the only reason that he left. When Marisol would tentatively approach her mother for something any of them needed, her mother would rage and call her and her siblings selfish parasites. Marisol recollects so many abusive days, but also when her mother entered a new relationship and was in love, that her mother would turn the house into what felt like a party, play music, cook, and dance. Those days were relatively rare, but she and her siblings held on to them. Marisol says it was only a miracle that, to her recollection, none of them were ever sexually abused by her mother's many boyfriends who cycled through the house. When Marisol was 21, she moved out after she met a man who came into the cafe where she worked. He encouraged her to come live with him and a group of people, and a man she met, and the man she met, all of whom were organized into this cultic organization, though she didn't understand that at the time. She was so grateful in this organization at being listened to, supported, being offered housing, and even having other people cook her meals, and they were still interested in what she had to say. It felt like family, which is something she really craved. The boyfriend who moved into this system soon became quite invalidating, verbally abusive, and he would disappear for stretches of time again. He would cite the rules of the family, as they called it, and that seeking bliss in their true selves meant exploring other people sexually. It didn't feel good, but she focused on being good. They had a son, at which point they moved into their own apartment. However, she raised the son within this cultic family system. Her boyfriend ended up leaving her with the son and moved in with a younger member of the cultic system. Marisol raised their son, tried to find work, ended up meeting another man within the system. Together, they ended up leaving the cultic system, and she married the man who raised her son as his own. Her husband ended up founding a successful company at which Marisol worked. And just also, it is an FYI, Marisol never finished high school. She and her husband went on to have 2 more children together. She looked around at their beautiful home, financial comfort, nice husband, and still felt unsettled. Her mother wanted to participate in her life now that Marisol was successful, and her ex-boyfriend was seeking more custody of their son and more money. Marisol thought of herself as rude and that she was selfish to be mad about any aspect of her life because of how well things turned out. She believed that if she was stronger, she would be more grateful, and she also felt that she was holding her mother at too high a standard, since her mother did grow up under abusive circumstances as well. She thought with age her mother would mellow and things would settle, but at least once per month, her mother would betray her trust, sharing inappropriate information with other people in the family, asking for money, and then giving it to her brother, promising to show up and then not coming. Marisol felt lonely and sometimes wished she still had the large structure of the cultic system around her, despite the abuses of the system. Or maybe because of the abuses of the system. She didn't feel confident in making friends outside of that system and was increasingly struggling with health issues. When she would make a new friend, it was an exhausting experience of her doing everything she could, remembering every little occasion, throwing birthday parties, going out of her way to be helpful because it felt rare and she didn't want to mess up a new friendship. She was also embarrassed about what she came from and found it hard to get close to people because she didn't want to talk about having been in a cult or having been from an abusive family. She consistently doubted everything she did and said she would monitor every word and felt very guilty when she came to therapy, saying, "I am depressed and I have no right to be." So I want you to just sort of sit with Marisol's case for a minute and reflect on some of the key themes in this. I'm also making sure I'm on do not disturb here. So Marisol's experience. There's so many things that happen in this particular case: predatory people and predatory systems, also subjugating systems in which giving up identity and any sense of subjective experience was expected to be given up. She had to subjugate herself to her mother's needs and was stuck in this cycle with her mother that didn't even end when she got into adulthood and had long since left the system, silencing her own needs, chronic self-monitoring, tremendous struggles with bringing her full self into any relationship. And as a result, some difficulty in making friendships, although she is very, very warm and gregarious, lots of justification of the behavior of people around her, lots of trauma bonding, anxiety, self-blame, tremendous amounts of confusion, and lots of shame. I want you to keep Marisol's experience in mind, because we also want to be aware that she did build a healthy marriage, and it was a very, very healthy marriage. They had their moments, but it was a healthy marriage. She's a healthy parent, and she does nurture her child's interests, her children's interests, and is very present with them. She pursues professional goals that are compelling to her, and she values close relationships, though she sometimes struggles at engaging in them or even where to begin. The experience of narcissistic abuse and antagonistic relational stress created lots of doubt, confusion, self-blame, of holding back of self, in essence, oftentimes an abandonment of self, especially in social situations. So even though she created all of these healthy spaces, she's not always able to enjoy them. There's almost this anhedonia that accompanies her, because it's either, how dare I be angry? Look how well things turned out. And as an FYI for her sibling, we'll actually talk about her siblings at the end. We're going to revisit Marisol after this whole program is done, so you can sort of see where all of this work goes. Okay. So there is a study that came out in 2019. The one thing that this work gets a lot of pushback on, where's the data? Where's the data? Where's the data? We actually just got our first set of pilot data on 500 people, and it's with the statistician right now. We're getting the data. But there is attempts to collect this data. It's not easy data to collect. There was one study, it was done in Australia. I didn't love their methodology, but it gave us some interesting stuff to chew on, right? They did a study where they compared people who were in relationships characterized by pathological patterns consistent with pathological narcissism. That's how they described it in their study. And they compared them to people who were in relationships with people who had either mood disorders or anxiety disorders or psychotic disorders or borderline personality disorder. Okay. Now, people who were in relationships with individuals who had patterns more consistent with pathological narcissism, sort of the clinical focus group here, reported much greater, significantly higher burden of stress compared to those in relationships with folks with other mental illnesses, drops in their well-being similar to those observed in people living with anxiety and mood disorders, people in intimate relationships with partners characterized or whose behaviors were characterized by pathological narcissism reported more distress than when we saw this in family relationships, which actually kind of makes sense from a dose response model. Those who were in current relationships with people who are sort of pathologically narcissistic reported more significant mental health concerns than all of the other groups. So let's just sort of start there, because this is that we're starting to get the data, right? And people are trying to parse out this group of people who are in relationships where it's much more consistent with the patterns consistent with narcissism, and they're not doing well. And yet the field of mental health is often quick to rally support for people who are in relationships with people with major mental illnesses, with addiction, with even dementia. But I would say a lot of those rules apply here, and it may even be worse because the narcissistic person is often functioning quite well in the world. So much of what this work is, and if you look at even what Dan Shaw, who's written widely on this issue, so much of what this work is, it's psychoeducation and addressing the relational dynamics, basically giving people clarity about what's happening in their relationships so we can sort of end some of these cycles of self-blame. Now, our clients who are largely experiencing, we have some of them who are largely experiencing the big issue is narcissistic abuse, right? That's what they're coming in with. And let's compare that to the group of clients who are much more complicated. For example, there's many clients come in. I have a narcissistic spouse and I don't know which way is up, but they're functioning well in other areas of their lives. They're able to maintain friendships. They're still going to work. We definitely see some decrements in attention, concentration, self-care. There's definitely negative affectivity, but that's one group. The other group is a group that's struggling a lot more. This is a group that might have complex trauma. They may have other major psychiatric issues on board. They themselves may have personality issues. Here's the issue. and again, we also might see people with much more complicated histories. They've had family of origin, narcissistic antagonistic issues. They've had relational narcissistic antagonistic issues, and they might have a more severe exposure to that. We have one group that improves beautifully on the basis of the psychoeducation. They're like, thank you. Didn't know this. Wish someone had told me, never taught me this in school. And we tend to see actually a relatively rapid improvement in those clients. Okay. And then in our ongoing work with them, we can focus on giving them support, validating their experience, seeing where it sort of undercut their sense of self, and really sort of working with them at that level in therapy, right? We can then take the client or do that individuation work. But in that other group, right, that other group where the psychoeducation is helping a little, but it's definitely not getting to the core of some of the deeper thematic work that needs to be done. Now we're sort of plumbing the depths into complex trauma, post-traumatic stress, the co-occurring mental health issue that may have even greater acuity. And these people might have had more severe experiences of narcissistic abuse or more protracted experience. These folks struggle a lot with feeling stuck, with emotional regulation. And the challenge is, because of the emotional regulation stuff, they sometimes really get into it with the narcissistic individual. So to the world, this just looks like a high conflict, volatile relationship. But we'd really have to work with this other client to these kinds of clients to determine exactly what's going on. Sometimes they are, maybe they sometimes are as volatile, and that is probably the most difficult version of this work. But I think it's important to understand the value of psychoeducation, which is a core pillar here, but also the limits. So let's really get to the core of what exactly is narcissistic abuse and what is antagonistic relational stress. That's a term I coined because there's a lot of pushback on this term narcissistic abuse, which had been sort of floating around in the ether for a long time. I'm like, well, let's name out the construct more accurately, at least amongst us as clinicians. This is my attempt at a different definition. I've given the lecture in so many different forms and shapes. I'm like, let me sit down. It's not a great definition. I think as a construct, I'm kind of moving off into different circles, but bear with me. I personally think it's the interpersonally harmful, deceitful, and invalidating patterns, behaviors, and alternating disruptions of safety and trust observed in a relationship with a person who has a personality style characterized by antagonism. And antagonism comprised of these 6 qualities: manipulation, arrogance, hostility, entitlement, variable empathy, and exploitativeness, right? That's the core of antagonism. And remember, antagonism shows up in other personality styles: the borderline style, the psychopathic antisocial style, the narcissistic style. So it shows up in these different sort of diagnostic typologies. The harmful behaviors allow the narcissistic antagonistic person to assert control and dominance in the relationship and maintain a grandiose and distorted appraisal of themselves, all of which protects their vulnerability, insecurity, and fragility and suppresses their shame, while resulting in significant psychological harm to the other person or persons in the relationship. These abusive behaviors alternate with periods of connection and comfort. In addition, there's typically the maintenance of separate behavioral repertoires by the narcissistic person, prosocial and gregarious in public, while behaving in an antagonistic manner in private, unobserved settings with partners, family, or those from whom validation is less valued, which augments the sense of confusion for those in these relationships. You will say, I say there's typically the maintenance of that when we talk about vulnerable narcissism. The vulnerable narcissist, not so prosocial and great, but in general, it's definitely a style that is very unique in mental health, sort of these 2 sorts of, if you will, bases. It is an evolving phenomenon. We're figuring this out because where this gets tricky, right? And I think where a lot of people are getting confused in the languaging here, when they say narcissistic abuse, they're actually talking about what's happening to these clients: the confusion, the rumination, the regret, the anxiety, all of that. It's not, it's the narcissistic abuse is actually what's happening in the relationship, right? The behaviors of the narcissistic person towards others in the system. The fallout of narcissistic abuse is the experience that the other person in the relationship is having. And what does this look like? I mean, the work we're now doing in my research is trying to differentiate this and show a construct that is separate and distinct from PTSD, complex PTSD, your sort of standard issue adjustment disorder, so-called codependency, which is not, or just generic relationship issues, right? This is the pattern that's manifested by the people in the relationships enduring these behaviors. Okay. So it becomes, again, I would imagine that many times it co-locates with these other patterns, and we'll sort of look at that we'll look at that pictorially. But at the end of the day, narcissistic abuse and antagonistic relational stress altogether, this is a form of relational abuse, and it's a form of relational trauma, and could be argued to be a betrayal trauma, right? There are obviously the bigger ticket betrayals that happen, the infidelities, the lies, the sharing of confidences inappropriately, the financial betrayals. But the other thing that can happen, and this frame is really important for clients, is that a lot of what happens in these relationships could be viewed as, I'm putting it as everyday betrayal. I don't mean to minimize it, but it's things like the daily invalidations people are experiencing in these relationships that they presumed were about love and connection, the daily dishonesties, the breaking of confidences, the disloyalty, the not being seen, the lack of equity could be viewed as a form of a betrayal, the lack of recognition, the objectification, existing only as a convenience for the narcissistic person or as a symbol of status or something. It's not fulfilling what we could call the relational duties. I don't mean sex there. I mean everything that we really is almost implicitly built in when we're in a relationship, of showing up, of being empathic, of being aware of the other person's needs, of reciprocity, of mutuality of regard. Those are relational duties. Those are even more pronounced in parenthood. Those are not fulfilled. That's a form of betrayal. Full-on psychological and physical abandonment would also qualify, which happens quite often under this auspices of narcissistic abuse. And then the general carelessness, the complete lack of regard for the other. And so the other person is constantly sort of on their back foot. Now, because narcissism's on a continuum, so too is this phenomenon of narcissistic abuse. And we'll be looking at that sort of pictorially in a moment too. In severe cases, we may actually view severe trauma, neglect, physical and sexual abuse, willful cruelty. Make no mistake, understanding narcissism and antagonism is crucial to understanding that. People say, well, now we're in the world of severe big T trauma. That's perpetrator stuff. Yes, it's perpetrator stuff. And the best way to understand perpetrator stuff is this personality, this characterologic analysis, because this is driving a lot of that behavior. And as a result, it also gives us guardrails and parameters to really help the client understand what they can really expect, especially if they have ongoing contact with this person. Now, when we look at this sort of in a child space, and we'll be talking about this more, parent to child, right? This is definitely, obviously, a dynamic that shapes the child's sense of self, schema of the world, internal working models, all of that. Obviously, this is seen in both. The impacts are going to be obviously developmentally more profound for a child when this is a parent. And what are the patterns we see? We see lack of attunement, ignoring the child's needs, dismissing the child's needs, and over time, just completely discouraging the child to have that inner world that is expressed and then subsequently is treated as an inconvenience or an affront by the parent. These are relationships characterized by no accountability, little recognition, or self-awareness. Now, in a child, this over time will not only be held somatically, it'll be held as nervous system responses. And we will see ongoing responses throughout adulthood, not just relationally, but in other areas of life that are a byproduct of this lifelong form of indoctrination. And all of this can happen in the absence of frank neglect and abuse. Enough of you have worked with clients who had a narcissistic parent where there's constantly that invisible hand pulling them back. They're having strong somatic reactions, or it's almost a repetition compulsion level of engaging in unhealthy relationships. I love Dan Shaw's work here, and he's talking about narcissistic abuse as a form of, if you will, identity theft, right? The other person ceases to exist in these relationships. It really is sort of an existential issue. The other person can't exist as a separate human being. The subject becomes an object, right? In a healthy relationship, you have two subjective realities. That subject becomes objectified in the narcissistic relationship. There's subject, there's object. There's narcissist who gets to have their world, and then there's the other person who exists for the narcissistic person's world. Everything has to be sacrificed for this relationship to keep going. And that includes identity, needs, like I said, but even perspectives and beliefs, if you're going to be able to survive without ongoing conflict. And so basically, the narcissistic person is engaging this form of identity theft, stealing that, and it bolsters the narcissistic person who gets those dominance needs met. And all of this harms a person when we're in a relationship, any of us, where we're not being seen or heard, it harms us, right? It doesn't inconvenience us. It doesn't just aggravate us. And when these are significant relationships, significant primary relationships, obviously most pronounced in parent to child, but even in long-term committed relationship, it really does, again, it erodes the person who is being objectified, whose subjectivity is being taken. And so what that means is the focus of our therapy. It means who are managing narcissistic relationships or recovering from a narcissistic relationship is about always fostering that sense of identity, fostering that sense of individuation. Small decisions, big decisions, chronic check-ins, how are you, validation of their subjective state becomes central to this work. Because we have two processes to address in this work. We have the actual narcissistic behavior, okay? So that what the client is being subjected to every day, whether it's the reality being doubted, the gaslighting, the rage, the passive aggression, the withholding, the betrayal, all those things that they're going to experience, we'll talk about in a minute. And then there's how it affects the other person, the narcissistic abuse, the fallout of the abuse. One of the other big things that keeps coming up in the conversation, though, and this is one of the pushbacks I've gotten over and over again, is so tell us the difference between emotional abuse and narcissistic abuse. Well, first of all, that I would say that there's a bit of a nesting here. I think narcissistic abuse is clearly a form of emotional abuse, but emotional abuse can happen with I'm going to use the word perpetrator, which may feel a bit strong, but just to make the distinction, emotional abuse can happen by a perpetrator or a person who has any variety of issues happening, right? We could be seeing anger dysregulation. We could be seeing addiction. We could even be seeing other major mental illness processes like a very irritable depression or untreated bipolar disorder. All in people with all of these patterns could be engaging in emotionally invalidating, neglectful, and harmful relationship of another person. But narcissistic abuse occupies a very unique territory here because these are very high functioning people not psychologically, right? But that's not the measure of what the world is looking for, right? To the world, people who are narcissistic they're successful. They're often financially quite sound. They're often in leadership, right? They often have a public facing persona that's considered to be very good, to be very solid, right? And so as a result of that, this emotional abuse is really multiplied by the idea that this is considered a good person, desirable person by the world. So the individual in the relationship is also experiencing the shape-shifting between good and bad. I'm with a person who's really successful. My partner's a physician. That's a really respectable profession. What am I complaining about? That going back and forth is where the struggle really happens and makes this a very unique space. Now, I understand in other forms of relational abuse, narcissism or not, we can see the shape-shifting. It's a lot of the domestic violence literature focuses on this. But I will go to my grave arguing that if not to 100%, well over 90% of domestic abusers are narcissistic. The absolute entitlement, lack of empathy, dysregulation, what else could that be? And I understand the historic reason we wouldn't call it that. I do. But by saying, well, let's not call it that, let's call it that. Because I think that there's an awareness of the personality style of the perpetrator. Are there commonalities? Huge commonalities. Like I said, ultimately the data is going to answer the question. And that's what we're collecting now as part of the construct validation study to see if narcissistic abuse that hangs as its own independent construct separate from emotional abuse. This whole idea of thin slicing antagonism, understanding it's the client's quest for a name for their pain, right? Clients want to know the why. Tell me, Dr. Ramani, tell me any of you, why are they doing this? Why is this happening, right? existentially, we all want a why. Now, the why is what I get to in all the other modules of this program. I'm going to do the best I can with the why today, but today we're talking more of the what. All right. But the why, like I said, pulls them off the what. And we're going to do the what today. And the what, frankly, folks, is that this behavior is harmful. Okay. And the why can't be readily addressed. That's the other problem with the why. I get why people have the why. And that's something I struggle with in my writing and my thinking on this. The why is sort of, it's almost like a curiosity at some point. Why would someone do this? Why is someone like this? Why are they this way? Right. But then in all that whying, we're not focusing on the whatting. And the whatting ultimately is that this behavior, regardless of the person's backstory, regardless of what kind of day they had, regardless of the idea that they're narcissistic, regardless of all of that, the behavior that's showing up is unacceptable in a relational context. And so this fallout our clients experience is this tension between us providing empathic balance between them wanting to know the why and even the why of the narcissistic person and the reality of the what. If you're working with narcissistic clients, this is a big part of the balancing act where we have empathy for the individual. I've always had empathy for the narcissistic clients. I really understand their why, and simultaneously being aware that their what isn't okay. For clients experiencing narcissistic abuse, this distinction is important, and it creates that tension, that dissonance of understanding the why and simultaneously not being okay with the what, if you will. Antagonism being the theme also becomes really important here. Remember back in the day, we used to talk about cluster B, right? Which was such a nice, quick, handy dandy. That's why I'm using almost antagonism as that snap in here for cluster B, right? Monolithically, most of the patterns of what happened with antagonistic folks, good old cluster B, are not going to change based on what our client does. There's no communication our client can engage in. There's no boundary our client can set. And the one thing I do hope, even if you only get this from today's, we've got to stop sending our clients into a war zone to try to change, address, or mitigate that other person, the antagonistic person's behavior. Not only does it not work, it results in reharm. We've got to give them a realistic look. And this is why a lot of two-chair work, even stuff like I was talking to Tan Dayton about psychodrama, like really working through in the room while it's safe about how we can work through these conversations. Because in a way, we as clinicians should be able to anticipate what the narcissist is going to do. There's a simplicity to their approaches. But the patterns, these so-called cluster B antagonistic, call them what you will, patterns, they're highly overlapping. The correlations are ridiculously high. Teasing out narcissism from borderline, from psychopathy, from shallow emotionality, I personally think it's impossible. I think that when we try to thin slice it, we are confusing the client. We're trying to do something that's actually inaccurate. And I understand the client's quest for a label, but staying on antagonism and the what, the unacceptability of the behavior becomes absolutely crucial. They want education about it. You don't want to shut them down. I'm not going to talk about borderline versus psychopathy, but you can help them understand that this is like a watercolor where all the colors are bleeding into each other. So we're going to start our journey about 3 steps in, right? It's like we're on a train and the train's been going for a minute. We're coming in here on stop 3. We're going to talk about the antagonistic and narcissistic behaviors here, okay? And we're going to be talking about stuff like love bombing and idealization and charm and charisma, because that actually, we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that. It was a dynamic, but that cycle of the relationship is what makes this confusing, right? That idealization, the charm, the charisma is what draws people in. And a lot of people say, oh, I'm so dumb. I was drawn to this person. I said, I'm sorry. Who would say no to handsome, successful, charming, and charismatic? Like, where did you learn that lesson? None of us did, right? So even sort of phenomenologically at the surface, all of us are drawn to these folks. Where things get sort of more complex is when the abusive behavior is on board and people get stuck and they don't know what they're dealing with because they're still looking to the person who on some days is all of these really sort of socially beneficent things. So I think that one thing our clients struggle with is like, what's going on? Like I just saying the why, what is happening? Why are they like this? I love this passage I'm about to share with you. It's written by Dan Shaw, who, like I said, his theoretical work here is great. But I love this because I think it really captures exactly what is happening, which is the relational system of the traumatizing narcissist, a system of subjugation in which a highly narcissistic person, through psychological manipulation that involves coercive persuasion and undue influence, disavows and projects shameful dependency into their targets. By finding recipients for these projections, he can control and exploit the shameful dependency he has cultivated in them, successfully disavowing shame and dependency, and avoid having to come to terms with it within himself. Shaw is obviously talking about a major sort of projective process, but in essence, it's almost parasitic, it's almost viral, that the other person has been infected with the shame of the narcissistic person, which is then exploited by the narcissistic person. Any of you who might have experienced this yourselves, and certainly work with clients who have gone through this absolutely captures what happens in these relationships. And this framework is certainly not going to be your opener in session 1. But as you go on in time and languaging this in a way that is understandable to a client, you're not going to just stick this passage in front of them, but helping them slowly but surely understand this, because then they can almost see. It's almost like I want you to view it as this sort of narcissistic projective stuff is getting tangled in with the client's true sense of self. Okay. The client is confused. And this is why the client at times thinks, am I the narcissistic person? So much of the shame has been projected onto them, right? Creating that shameful dependency he speaks on. The client is confused. You know what our job is? It's almost like we're going in there and trying to untangle everything. Imagine it as like nets sort of getting tangled with seaweed. We're getting the seaweed out so they can use a net, so they can be themselves. And the more our clients have to engage in these relationships, the deeper they're in, the more daily the contact, the more significant the contact, the more they have to disengage from themselves and frankly abandon themselves, because to stay in their true self is probably too unsafe in these relationships. To work with these clients is to recognize that this is definitely a lifelong process. It's the narcissistic behavior is happening. The client is losing this subjective sense of self. They're in service, in this case, to a narcissistic parent. As a result, the client is chronically living in reaction, right? Because you're not living in a dyadic sort of exchange of being seen, of attunement. In these relationships, the other person is chronically living in reaction to the narcissistic person, because we can't figure out the consistency, because the inner world of the narcissistic person is very much driven by the external world around them. Then what happens is, through the course of treatment, through therapy, the client is now being given permission to feel what's happening, not just react to it, but feel it, process it, and get clarity through psychoeducation. The longer term work is individuation of self, the tangle, the getting the seaweed off the net, as it were. Individuate the self separate from the narcissistic person, wants, needs, identity, hopes, aspirations, authenticity. And then sort of the top of the mount, as it were, is that the capacity for the client to express their authentic selves, experiencing joy subjectively, giving weight to their true selves without shame. Do we get all our clients to that last box? Not always. I mean, it's a luxury to be able to engage in therapy this long, but a combination of therapy, group work, and even self-education can get clients further than you think. We have to understand that there's a spectrum of severity of this behavior. At the mild side, we'll see, mild narcissistic abuse looks like a person who's sort of a partner, a family member, whomever it is. The narcissistic person is irritable. Their behavior is irritable, with lots of variance back to normal, and irritable, normal. There's a lot of self-centeredness, and there's a lot of distraction. There's not that much attunement. There's emotional immaturity, and they can't be present with the needs of the other. So this is sort of the 50-year-old spouse who's still complaining like a 16-year-old when they're being asked to empty the dishwasher. It is this sense of like, always like, oh my gosh, here we go again. So our clients who are getting exposed to mild narcissistic abuse, they're exhausted. Those relational duties aren't being fulfilled. It's often not that sense of, not so much the loss of self in these clients as a kind of a chronic source of stress and a sort of, do I stay? Do I go? Like, we have a life, but I feel like I live with an adolescent. If this is a parent, there can be a lot of anger that this parent was not available as an adult parent needed to be when they were a child, but not in that way we're going to see in the moderate spectrum. In the moderate spectrum of narcissistic abuse, we're seeing much more pronounced invalidation. It's much more consistent. There's more either passive aggressive, overt anger, passive aggressive anger, comma, overt anger, yelling, screaming, that kind of thing, withdrawing or withholding in the face of anger. There's a lot of validation. There's, again, a lot of still that backing and forthing between good days and bad days, but the down slopes, those bad days and the periods of bad days will be much more pronounced than we'd see in the mild narcissistic abuse. And there are much more significant betrayals that happen within the relationship, whether they're financial betrayals, intimacy betrayals, infidelities, sharing of information they shouldn't share, that sort of thing. Much more significant breaches of trust. This moderate area, folks, is where we're going to see most of our clients coming to traditional outpatient practices. The mild narcissism, we might actually see them coming in like, I'm having trouble with my partner. And then they might just sort of, it's adjustment sort of stuff. But that the moderate folks are going to come into therapy with more acute distress. At the severe level of narcissistic abuse, here's where we're seeing things like coercive control and other coercive dynamics, exploitation. We might see now an escalation to physical abuse, sexual coercion. Rage is much, much more unsettling. There's also a much greater likelihood of significant isolation at this point. While there might sometimes be vacillation, for example, if there had been a period of significant aggression, abuse, then there might be sort of that sort of the honeymoon period, the tension is relieved. And so now there's sort of an attempt to go back to like, here's a gift, a sort of a mild attempt at that. But menace remains the central dynamic. Even on the good day, the person in the situation is aware the menace can return. Those of you working in DV situation, DV clinics, DV programs, community clinics that are dealing with more acute mental health stuff, you're more likely to see this group. And we now know that safety is an issue there. So now we're going to move our focus to narcissistic abuse and antagonistic relational behavior. And specifically, what does it look like? As much as, again, in part of this research, this is what I'm giving you here, sort of rather clinically and theoretically formulated. We're doing the empirical work to see how these things sort of behave in a factor analysis. Do these patterns of behavior sort of cluster as suggested here? I mean, I'll let you know when the numbers come out. But we sort of have sort of 6 kind of chunks of buckets where these behaviors, these narcissistically abusive, antagonistic behaviors show up in a relationship. So let's start at the top with what I call the dimmer patterns, right? I've used dimmer because it was a way to capture the various behaviors as an acronym, the dismissiveness, invalidation, manipulation, minimization, and so forth. So you'll see that as I get into this. The dimmer patterns, though, I use that acronym for a reason, because they really do turn down the other person's light. These are the behaviors that end up invalidating people, manipulation, and they foster an imbalance in the relationship. Remember, by definition, narcissistic relationships are asymmetric, with one person holding a disproportionate balance of the power. So in this scenario, we have April, who had finished school. She wanted to be an art teacher, and then she had an idea to open studios and galleries as an entrepreneurial endeavor. Her father, who had been frequently dismissive of her interest in art and teaching, telling her basically, you're wasting your time and money, learn STEM, that's the future. And then if you want to color on the weekends, then you'll have the money to do it. He helped her siblings with their tuition because they pursued majors and professions in line with what he believed was important. When she shared her new idea at a family dinner, he laughed out loud. April had received some acclaim for her work. Her studio idea had raised some capital and been awarded a grant, and her family said, well, you better hire a real professional to give you some guidance. You're out of your depth, April. At the launch of the first small studio, her sister showed up and proceeded to talk to one of the investors, sharing her ideas for how to make it better and connecting the person to the sister's own network. April was horrified that her sister felt that this was okay and felt that once again, her family had overstepped. Her sister turned to her and said, stop exaggerating. I didn't do anything wrong. I did you a favor. You need my help if you want to turn this into something. So this is sort of an example of what can happen intrafamilially. And even when the person keeps trying to exert themselves into their individuated autonomous self, that family will continue in sort of that dismantling process. So the dimmer patterns sort of fall under, like I said, it's a nice kind of easily accessible acronym to even help you communicate with clients about this. Let's start with the dismissiveness, the invalidation, and the minimization. These are things like, oh, God, that's not important. It's nothing. Stop making such a big deal of it. You don't know what you're talking about. It's a systematic devaluing of everything about the other person, their experiences, their opinions, their perspectives, everything about the other person. It's a minimization of their concerns. If they are worried about something, it's going to be okay. Or like, I understand why you're worried. It's like, oh, it's not a big deal. Stop talking about it. So it's also shutting them down. It's the not acknowledging or recognizing or taking of note anything about the existence of the other person. It may be the criticism or the devaluation of accomplishments, like that scenario of April. It could be simple things like somehow a dinner someone put together. It could be the bigger things of how someone's incompetent at their job. And it could be pretty passive aggressive. It seems pretty straightforward. Well, oh, so your boss told you did a nice job. Well, it seems straightforward. It seems like anyone could have done it, right? We often see that people in narcissistic relationships sort of experience a kind of an existential death. And these patterns, the dismissiveness, the invalidation, and the minimization are often at the core of this because you're repeatedly told, like, and listen, people in these relationships will often say, over time, it's as though I cease to exist. Like I could have been talking words and they're not being registered. They're literally not being registered. And sometimes I said, well, let's do something paradoxical, say something ridiculous. Like there is an orange spotted kangaroo going through the backyard and see what you get as a response. Because it helped them when the response was like, yeah, whatever. Then they're like, oh, they really aren't listening to me. Either that, or maybe this one time they'll finally look out the window. In the first part of the dimmer patterns, the other person's experience is completely negated. Achievements are minimized too. Again, we saw that in the story of April. There's a tremendous amount of hypocrisy in these dynamics. For the narcissistic person, if you were to take this stance, not get very excited about something they did or really take note of their experience, they would get incensed. So in essence, what's being communicated over time, whether to a child or an adult, is my experience is important, but yours is completely irrelevant. Minimization of health issues is quite common. And many times narcissistic people will tell a partner like, oh, stop making such a big deal of it. That's all in your head. They'll get that sort of feedback. And because these relationships are stressful, very stressful, it is not unusual for some clients to experience stress-oriented health issues, and especially what the sort of fall into the bucket of the invisible illnesses, the entire spectrum, for example, of autoimmune illness, where still clients, especially women and people of color, get a lot of gaslighting when they go into healthcare settings. So you can imagine that double whammy, that the person's really feeling awful and sick. They're often not even getting supported by the healthcare profession. And because there's no sort of visible illness or not a clearly diagnosed one, the narcissistic person doubles down on that. Oh, it's nothing. And they're actually the cause of the stress that is causing this flare up, right? Then there's their behavior. It shows no recognition, whether it's not attuning to the partner or the other person, lifting their eyes, looking at them, acknowledging them, giving feedback that shows that they heard them. But this provides again the basis for the subjugation that characterizes narcissistic relationships, and obviously incredibly impactful for children who experience this with narcissistic parents who really start to believe I'm not worth seeing, and will kind of keep that identity and maintain that identity into adulthood. Now, manipulation is obviously a core dynamic of these relationships, and manipulation is a tactic that people engage in to achieve what the manipulator wants, but they make it seem that it's in the other person's interest too. So whatever it is the manipulative person is selling, it's really good for them, but they're literally trying to sell the idea that it's good for the other person too, or it plays on the vulnerabilities of the other person, like a fear of abandonment. So they'll turn something around that works for them maybe a promotion to a new job that requires moving a family and pulling all the kids out of school just as kids were adjusting or having trouble adjusting to it, and then selling it as, oh gosh, us moving to the city is going to be great because you're the one who said you wanted to be close to museums and stuff. It can sometimes be that benign, but the other person feels played. Manipulation leaves people feeling played. And I'll tell you, a lot of clients have said to me, it's that piece of being played that doesn't feel good, especially for a client who says, I don't consider myself a dumb or naive person, but this doesn't feel good. That I almost feel like someone just ran a hustle on me in the street. It's just the difference is that someone is running a hustle on you. They're just doing it in your own home. And that's what's really challenging. And puts clients off. These manipulations can show up in intimate relationships. It could show up with children. So you're choosing to spend time with your friends tonight, except me. Well, since your dad and I split up, I'm alone here a lot. So an adolescent child may then feel compelled to stay home with the mother who is saying something like that. You said you cared so much about the patients or the students in this job, and then you say you can't do this extra work. That's weird to me. And you're like, well, I do care about the patients, but I do have something else to do. So you can see how, again, in the right hands or the wrong hands, this can turn into something that compels people to do things that they actually are not good for them. Manipulation also can sort of end communication because it often can take people away from the original conversation. And the client then kind of gets themselves in this rabbit hole of having to constantly defend or explain themselves because the manipulator has taken the conversation into a new place that takes it away from this benefits me to you're doing a bad thing to get that person then to sign off. And then the manipulative person will say, well, you agreed to do this. Was it really agreement? And this idea of consent becomes a really important sort of issue to come back to with these clients. It's often an interpretive, like, again, calling it an interpretive alteration of reality to create something that is beneficial to the manipulator. Things like, you've never been committed enough to this relationship. If a person still cares about the relationship, then that's not their truth. Now we're starting to veer into gaslighting, which we'll talk about. Then the person will take too much responsibility for what's going on in the relationship. And then there's also many of our clients don't like this word manipulation. They don't want to identify what their mother is doing manipulative. Many, I'd say the vast majority will say, yes, I know my mother's manipulative. I know my partner's manipulative. But some will hate to use this sort of framing, especially when it's different kinds of relationships like adult children or in relationships where they still haven't had the insight that this might be a narcissistic person. The E in the dimmer patterns is entitlement. Entitlement is the trunk of the tree that unites all narcissism. Okay, all types of narcissism, malignant, vulnerable, grandiose, communal, all of them. This is the one thing that unites all narcissism. It's probably the overarching characteristic. It's an element of grandiosity that I am more special than you. That's the messaging behind entitlement. The rules don't apply to me, but the rules apply to you. I'm special. Probably only other special people could understand me. As a result of being special, I need exceptional treatment. I certainly shouldn't wait in a line, or I shouldn't be given anything but the best table in a place, or I should have the best job right away. And as a result, genuinely believe that they should be held to a different set of behavioral standards, and there should be no consequences, and this chronic hypocrisy. This is a form of abuse in a relationship because it's inaccurate, right? It's wrong. It's a distortion of reality. And it is the communication, I'm worthy, you're not. And again, creates that sort of dimmer sort of cycle. It's it's where we see that the narcissistically abusive person's needs sort of, it's a codification that their needs are more important than the other person's needs. I am better. I am more valuable. I'm more important. I know more than you, right? So there's a lot of superciliousness and superiority. And they really, the narcissistic person, like, no, I know this, you don't. And you're thinking, I researched this for months. You did know it better, but they come in so strong until a person knows what this is, they'll often sort of cow to what the narcissistic entitled person is saying. I would argue that the rage, the withholding, the bad behavior that the narcissistic person expresses when they're frustrated, that's a form of entitlement, as though I can express myself any way I want, no matter how it affects other people. Obviously, the relationship becomes unbalanced, inequitable, and it can also raise feelings of humiliation and shame. For people in these relationships, they'll say, this is so embarrassing. We're in the restaurant. They're behaving so badly. This is not at all who I am. And some people will say, I spent my entire adult life almost like coming behind the narcissistic person, sweeping up. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry they put you through that, and making apologies. Some people said it even got expensive. They would have their partner or family member would scream at someone who might have, for example, done some work on the house, and they'll come back behind and say, here's another $100 for you having to go through that kind of thing. So they'll say, I will do anything I can to protect these other people, but they felt a tremendous amount of shame. And over time, that shame can get internalized. And all of this can maintain these very asymmetric dynamics in these systems. The R in dimmer is the rage and the reactivity, okay? Rage is a universal in narcissistic relationships. Here's where we'll see the dysregulation, and it's often a byproduct of the activation of shame. Because I have this new book coming out, and I've been talking with a lot of people, sort of lay people about narcissism. The best example I can give, and this visual might help all of us too, is this idea of within the narcissistic person is almost a volcano that they don't realize is there. And the lava and the stuff in that volcano, the explosive stuff, is insecurity and shame. And they're not in conscious awareness of it, but it's always bubbling, creating this sort of kind of unstable seismic activity, creating that edginess we see in people with narcissistic personalities. Now imagine on top of that volcano, there's a manhole cover, right? That thing in the street that they have in the street, big, heavy manhole cover. And when there's anything in their lives, in the narcissistic person's life, like frustration, disappointment, their entitlement, their perfectionism getting pinged, like you're not so perfect, the manhole cover in essence gets kicked off of the top of the volcano a little, and some of that steam and lava emerges. And that comes out as an experience of rage against whomever kicked that manhole cover deliberately or inadvertently. People talk about what happens in narcissism as thin-skinned reactivity, that they're very provocable. And this is a lot of Brad Bushman and Baumeister's work, where they talk about the provocation and that provocability, I guess, that narcissistic people have, is that because of that chronic seismic activity, there's always this kind of edge. So if there's anything happening in the room that feels like it's any kind of threat, there's a very, very quick strike in the face of that, right? And so people in relationships like this are always afraid of when that rage snap is going to become. So they often modify their behavior to not do anything that will set off that rage. And the rage may be overt, like again, screaming or assaultive. It can be passive rage, withholding, silence, withdrawing. Any form of ego injury will result in rage. And again, don't mean yelling and screaming rage. It could also be that the person withdraws and withholds. And when we go back to the manipulation vocabulary, once a narcissistic person realizes abandonment is the other person's wound, it becomes a very powerful play, but it also may be what that narcissistic person learned to do in childhood, which was to withdraw as well. Anyone in these relationships, as a result, starts to hold back, walking on the proverbial eggshells. And then the rage is often a catalyst for other patterns we will see that we're about to talk about in narcissistic abuse. Not just the rage is this form of abuse, but the anticipation of rage, the conditions created by the anticipation of rage are also a form of abuse, right? That sense of menace, that sense of tension, that sense of, I have to stay in line. So there has to be full subjugation of self by the other person or people in the relationship, so you don't even get close to setting off that rage. And then when the client says, I'm the one who set them off, you will literally hear remorse on the part of setting off the rage of the narcissistic client, and that the client will almost be blaming themselves for will be blaming themselves for another person's anger. So let's take a little look at gaslighting. I just did a 6-hour program on gaslighting, so we're going to do it a little quicker than that. It was the 2022 word of the year. I'm thinking 2024 might be the year narcissism's the word of the year. And then we all need to have a big party, because I think that's a coming. It's been gaslighting. Interesting. The other word of the year, Oxford always chooses a popular word of the year. And they chose the Oxford. So Merriam-Webster tends to use a more conventional, popular word, gaslighting. A few years ago, I think in 2019, 18, the word of the year was toxic. But the Oxford word of the year, and I wish if we had chat here, I would have said, put this in the chat if you knew. It was Riz. Well, no, an older lady like me did not know what Riz was. I had to look it up. Riz is sort of a young people slang for charisma, right? So Riz, and it's considered a good thing. And I was like, oh my gosh, we're going backwards. So, um, Riz, we've talked about. Gaslighting is what we're about to talk about. So Robin Stern's written some really nice stuff on the gaslight effect. And in many ways, he's used the gaslight effect to capture a lot of the themes of the narcissistic relationship. But Stern's definition of this sort of so-called gaslight effect is the relationship between two people, a gaslighter who needs to be right in order to preserve his own sense of self and his sense of having power in the world, and a gaslightee who allows the gaslighter to define her sense of reality because she idolizes him and seeks his approval. I'm putting this definition up here because I'm going to say I don't fully agree with it. Okay? Allows the gaslighter implies that there's an active process. I actually think when people are being gaslighted, that attachment needs are operating. So gaslighting is predicated on trust, okay? Trust of a family member, trust of a partner, frankly, trust of an expert, okay? It has to be that baseline trust. Don't know how much of it is an allowing as much as it's simply part of the sociality and the trust and the attachment we may have in an existing relationship. I also don't always think that people are being gaslighted, idealize the other person, or seek their approval. They may seek closeness. That's different than approval. So you can see that even within the field, we ain't all agreeing. Okay. But so I have a slightly different take on it, but I want you to see, I think it's very important when we're doing this work is to see the different perspectives and sort of see, sort of hear the critiques. And I'm sure people would critique my approach, which is completely fine. I think that's how we grow. So let's take a look at a case of gaslighting. Take a look at Ashanti. Ashanti had revised herself in many ways to stay in her relationship. She stepped away from her career as a nurse practitioner to support her partner's career and raise their children. She dropped out of a doctoral nursing program as well. Her partner was spending more time and later at work, and Ashanti suggested that perhaps she pick up a few shifts somewhere so he could work less. They could have more time as a family, and the children could see him more. He responded to her with, I'm not working that late. I'm with the children all the time. She felt insane because it wasn't true. She pushed a little more and said, look, here are the notifications from our house alarm system that show when the doors get open. You got home at 1 a.m. 3 nights in a row. That is working late. He then reacted with anger and said, oh, so I'm living in a surveillance state now? Your jealousy and paranoia are off the chart. Sometimes I wonder if you would be happier if my career failed. You like my job when it buys us a new car, don't you? Ashanti felt shut down and like she couldn't respond and found herself lost in thinking whether she was the one who was ungrateful, unrealistic, or greedy. A month later, her cousin told her that she had seen her husband, Ashanti's husband, in the city with a mutual woman friend when he had told Ashanti he was doing an overnight at the hospital where he worked. When she confronted him, he said, enough. I can't live like this. Do you have little alarm cameras in the city too? I'm beginning to think that you don't want this marriage to work, so you're trying to blow it up. He never responded honestly to her questions or at all about him being in the city, seen in the city with their friend. Ashanti wasn't ready for her marriage to end, so she apologized and said, I don't know why I said that. I think I have mom brain fog. Of course, I want us to work, and I know how hard you work. Over time, she actually started distancing from that friend who observed the husband with the other woman and just allowed the relationship, Ashanti with her husband, to unfold in a way that worked for her partner. It was easier, and she often questioned and wondered if she was seeing things clearly. This is what gaslighting does to a person. It literally completely delaminates them from any sense of reality. So what is gaslighting? I do think we all do agree that it's a form of psychological manipulation. Most would say it's a form of emotional abuse. It results in a person questioning their own sanity, their own perspectives, their own memory, and their own experiences. And it works through a systematic pattern of the gaslighter generating doubt and subsequent doubt of all of those things, of experiences, memories, emotions, judgment, all of it. It involves using multiple techniques, including deceit, misdirection, contradiction, accusation. All of these things are part of sort of the gaslighting tactic toolbox. The other person then is destabilized and is not able to clearly evaluate the situation, often being pulled into a more emotional state. It's almost like that sort of what Janina Fisher talks, the left brain going to right? Almost like a polyvagal kind of we now go into the emotion from the very logical, like clearly you came home at 1 a.m., jumps the rails because a person is so destabilized. It is a subjective hijacking because it's a taking away of a person's subjective experience, and it causes a person to question any grip that they have on reality. The thing is though, it's not just the doubting of experience. The gaslighter goes on to doubt the sanity or the mental fitness of the other person. They doubt so the other person then doubts their instincts. They doubt they doubt everything, honestly, about themselves, and they get very cognitively destabilized, and so are constantly confused. And even if we were to ask someone like Ashanti, how's it going in your marriage? Frankly, a client like that would be like, I actually don't know. You'll get a lot of I don't knows from these clients. The narcissistic relationship being a lack of intersubjectivity, Shaw's term really gets at that. So what does gaslighting do? It plays on existing gaps on self-esteem and self-concept. So if a client, for example, if you had a client who went through childhood gaslighting, right? And now they're in this adult relationship, you'll see them, they have this sort of decrements in self-esteem or not fully formed self-concept because it couldn't develop with a narcissistic parent. When being gaslighted in an adult relationship, will say like, who do I think I am? They could be right. Or I don't know, maybe I don't know. Maybe I am the one who doesn't get it. It can happen because there's enough enablers. I call this sort of the emperor's clothes variant, right? The world at large doesn't call out the gaslighting behavior. In this case, her friend did, but a lot don't. They'll say, oh, what a great person you're in this relationship with. Oh, you come from such a great family. So a person may feel silenced under these circumstances. The gaslighting may play on an existing vulnerability. For example, like I said, being gaslighted in childhood or self-doubt that may emanate from other adverse experiences, like, for example, trauma. It may play on attachment needs and empathy. Your client cares about someone, they love someone, they have a history with someone. So they're going to blame themselves or make up excuses. That's when we get into the realm of cognitive dissonance. We can be gaslighted because we think they know what they're talking about. If somebody either is an expert, this is why healthcare professionals can so easily gaslight, right? Well, the doctor knows, so they must know that this isn't real. We'll believe that, even though we're like, gosh, I really do feel sick. Or there are people in our lives we're told to trust. And let me tell you where this comes up a lot, especially in narcissistic marriages, is around finances. You will see that many times, and it'll often be quite gendered. Well, the narcissistic part doesn't matter the gender. Usually the dominating partner will say, I understand about money. So many people are socialized to think they don't know anything about money. Comes to divorce time, and a lot of money is sitting in some really weird places, or was managed wrong, or was just spent, and the person wasn't told about it, and you can't make it come out of nowhere, right? So we think that they know what they're talking about it, because remember, narcissistic folks are really confident, and they can sell that game. And you can be gaslighted because you don't have as much power. The client, I should say, doesn't have as much power in society. And this is where we have to recognize intersectional characteristics, gender identity, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, culture, immigration status, religion, nationality. All these things have to be considered because people who may not have societal power, be diminished in society, they will always have the advantage of being believed by the world. The more powerful person will be believed, which means that the person who may not have that societal power for any number of reasons will believe the gaslighting because they're often sort of overwhelmed by society at large, and the other person gets to control the narrative. We have to be aware of these sorts of vulnerabilities to gaslighting at an even higher level in our clients. But it is a process that capitalizes on trust, involves that theft of reality. Step 3 is what people often forget. It's not as simple as saying, that didn't happen. I never said that. That's phase 1 of gaslighting, but you haven't finished the circle. Convincing the other person they're not well, depicting them as mentally unweak, or like, you don't know what you're talking about. You must be experiencing dementia, or you're having memory problems. Are you sure you haven't gone seen a therapist about that? That they they depict the other person as not being well put together, continue cultivating the self-doubt, right? So keep repeating the process. So the person is doubting themselves more and more, like Ashanti. And this now is really a form, now we're seeing a form of indoctrination, because now the person has sort of given in. The client is no longer trusting themselves. They don't, certainly not enough to push back. Initially, Ashanti did push back, right? And you can see where that went. And then ultimate threats were dangled out there, like a threat of abandonment. And then this can ultimately look like consent and even agreement to the world. And that should be, I forgot to fix this slide again. And I meant to, which is it should be RVO is internalized, right? So RVO, by that I mean, let me make a note of that, 43. There's a concept called DARVO, which I actually spoke about in the larger training. It's discussed in a module of that, in the dynamics module of this larger training. But just very briefly, DARVO stands for deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. Okay, so that should be RVO, not VRO. And while this is Dr. Jennifer Fried's work, she initially did this work on people who were sexual assault perpetrators, but has since broadened this, and it really does apply quite a bit in antagonistic relationships, that when the narcissistic when the narcissistic person is confronted, like Ashanti's husband, they will deny, they will attack, surveillance state, right? And then they'll reverse, victim, and offender. Oh, I worked so hard. How could you do this to me? That gets internalized by the client, who now sometimes feels as though they're the offender, they're the problem. Oh my gosh, I've set up I've set up the surveillance state. I am being too demanding. I'm being too difficult. They are taking good care of us financially. So then you can see the switch. Or my mother's been through so much. How could I have questioned her? So when that switch happens, and you add that as an extra step to gaslighting, you now have a person who's not only confused and doubting themselves, they may literally believe they're a bad person, which is why when so many of these clients present to therapy, there'll be a relatively well-developed narrative that somehow they're also the problem. And when you throw in there a lot of the conventional relationship chit chat about how both people in a relationship are responsible, I'm sorry, I don't view trauma bondedness as responsibility in a relationship. I view it as a dynamic that once we shed light on for the client, they often do step away. But to make it all about shared responsibility, I actually think is hegemonic and doesn't recognize the dynamics of these relationships. I'm just putting this up here as sort of examples of some of the terminology some of your clients might bring in when they're talking about gaslighting. And this could be everything like, why are you being so sensitive? And that never happened. And, your mind isn't working well. There might even be sort of, again, these sorts of even biological explanations. Oh, you always get like this around your period. But these sorts of phrases will actually, like I said, it'll put people in that reactive mode into more of an emotional mode, out of a place where they were seeing it clearly. And if a person doesn't know what gaslighting is, especially things like, why can't you take a joke? That is a big one for clients who think, oh, I'm humorless, I'm rigid, I'm cold, I'm not fun. Why can't you take a joke, right? But that's a big part of that sort of gaslighting spectrum. I like to think of it as sort of the pathologically insecure preying on the conventionally insecure. The pathologically insecure individual being narcissistic, the conventionally insecure being anybody who's just sort of a person walking around the world, right? The gaslighter wants power and control and domination, like a narcissist would. The target gets gaslighted. The target gets more and more insecure, more and more self-doubting, and will capitulate and go along. And then the gaslighter gets big and powerful, and as a result, is in a better position to continue to manipulate the target. Gaslighting puts power into the gaslighter. That's what it does. And this is not to say that all of the targets, all of the clients we're working with who get into these relationships are shrinking violets. Not at all. They're often entering these relationships as very competent, well-adjusted people who believe in love, who believe in a relationship, who are excited about this person, were once happy about it, not anymore. But the idea that, oh, this is just a person with low self-esteem who got played. If we trust someone, we're gaslightable unless we understand what the dynamic is. And that's why it's so important for our clients to understand it. A psychiatrist named Theodore Papp, who's based in Seattle, talked about this idea of the double whammy when it comes to gaslighting. And I think it's, again, this is why I'm making this point, because so many people are walking around thinking gaslighting is just somebody saying that never happened. That's a part of the process, but it's not the whole process. And when he calls it the double whammy, he means it's insulting and verbally abusing, right? You don't know what you're talking about and you're stupid, right? You undermine the client, the client or the target's confidence in what their perceptions are. And you're manipulating reality and you're manipulating, you're manipulating reality and you're manipulating identity. And in essence, what Dorpat was arguing is that the gaslighter was actually engaging in emotional regulation by controlling the interpersonal interactions, which again, we know is a classical dynamic in narcissism. But let's get at this issue of gaslighting and lying, because a lot of times even therapists wonder about this, but I think a lot of clients are confused by it too. All gaslighters lie, not all liars gaslight, okay? People lie, right? But they're not always gaslighting. You need that next step of telling someone that there's something wrong with them for it to qualify as a gaslight. Lying is a denial of reality, okay? Gaslighting both denies reality and dismantles the target, right? When we're talking about lying, we're talking about we're talking about evidence, right? We're going down an epistemic path here, and I'm going to kind of keep that tight, but it's about the evidence. Gaslighters, though, if a person lies, they're only lying, and you show them the evidence, they may even get mad at it, but there'll be a grudging acceptance like, yes, okay, yes, there's the documents, right? It's kind of like gotcha. There's no gotcha with a gaslighter, right? Gaslighters aren't interested in evidence. That's why when the person says, you were coming in, the system shows you came in at 1 a.m. Here's the text, here's the letter, here's the document. They're not interested. That's not what this is about. Gaslighting is about power. It's about control. It's about domination. It's about breaking down the target. So that's why your clients have been exhausting themselves, coming up with the evidence base, not only getting nowhere, but it almost feeling like it makes things worse. So we can just sort of use this as an example, something I've used and sometimes helps clarify it. Isn't gaslighting just lying? Well, let's just say there's two people in a relationship. Partner A goes to a bar and stays too long instead of going home for dinner on time and doesn't say that they had planned on that. Partner B is upset about this, actually drives to the bar, and they see partner A sitting at an outside table enjoying drinks with friends. Lying would be if partner B said, "Were you at the bar?" And A says, "No, I was not at the bar." Okay. Gaslighting is when partner B tells partner A that they actually drove to the bar and saw them there. And partner A says, "You couldn't have seen that because I wasn't there. So you didn't see me there." And frankly, oh my gosh, like, let's really talk about the issue here. You are paranoid. I don't think I can take this much longer. You're putting me through too much. And then partner B apologizes for being so sensitive or mistrustful and pathologizes themselves. That's more of what that gaslighting process looks like. The dynamics of gaslighting, again, include indoctrination. It's not unusual to see threatened abandonment. So if a person pushes hard against a gaslighter, really hard, right? Ashanti had pushed hard against her husband, and he did that. The idea would be, well, maybe this isn't working for us anymore. And your client may not be ready for the relationship to end. They want to make it better. They want to grow it. They want there to be accountability. But when the gaslighter pushes back with, well, I guess this isn't working out, that can really accelerate the likelihood of capitulation. Listen, it could even be a patient with a doctor, and the doctor's like, well, you know what? I don't know if I can keep working with you. You keep making these, you keep asking for all these tests. No, I won't ask for that anymore, right? We could even have it happen in a non sort of intimate kind of relationship. It can happen in any form of gaslighting relationship. The mocking the target, the making a joke out of them. That's a common dynamic that often gets missed. This idea of fostering dependency and becoming the reassurer. I once talked with a woman, did an interview with a woman, and I think the way she said it was one of the most stunning ways to portray what happens in these relationships, especially when it comes in terms of gaslighting. She said that the relationship was absolutely intoxicating. She felt as though she was taken to the top of a 100-story building. And then when she got to the top of the 100-story building, he pushed her off. And then he was waiting there at the 4th story to catch her before she hit the ground. And then he told her, "You should have been more careful there at the top. You're so clumsy." And because he saved her, she believed him. That I think really captures that sort of also that savior perpetrator complex we see in the narcissistic relationship, which is an element of gaslighting. So there are many forms of gaslighting. And as we sort of teeter here, and we have a couple more minutes before our break. I'm going to sort of go through some of these, and then we can revisit some of them again before we, as we go into the next module. But there's so many ways gaslighting shows up. So let's take a look at some of these, and then we'll obviously in a few minutes, we're going to take a break for about 15 minutes. You can use the bathroom and everything. And also Anna's going to see if there's been any questions, and then we'll come back to these. But things like emotional minimizing, like you're being too sensitive, doubting a person's commitment to the relationship. I guess you don't really care about us if you're considering X or Y, something that would foster the subjective self. When people make presumed motivational or emotional attributions, why are you so angry? Why are you always so negative? And the person receiving that accusation will be like, I'm not even angry. What's happening here? And so now a person is sort of questioning their inner state because an emotion has sort of been inserted into them, usually an emotion that the narcissistic person or gaslighter would know that other person it's not exactly what the emotion they want to be viewed as having. They make attributions about mental health when we're gaslighted. You're paranoid, you're mentally ill, you're psychotic. Stonewalling, I would argue, is part of the gaslighting dynamic. Don't tell me that again. I don't want to hear it. Right? So this has effectively ended any forward conversation. Something I call affirmation coded criticism could be part of the gaslighting dynamic. No one's ever going to love you the way that I love you, which is a very menacing dynamic, I actually think. But it's that it's saying you're so lovable, but no one else in the world is going to love you, right? If I'm so lovable, then everyone should love me, right? But that's not what they're sharing. The pain competition concept. So when a person is sharing with the narcissistic person or someone who's a gaslighter, they might hear things like, well, at least you have this, or stop complaining, my job doesn't have that. So the sense that your pain isn't valid enough, and it also falls under that minimization dynamic. The diminishment of ability, being told, I don't think that was that difficult. Not answering the question can be a form of gaslighting. What we call the judge and jury model, the client being told by the gaslighter, you have no right to feel that way. There's nothing that warrants you feeling that way, as though you need some sort of approval form to have a feeling in one of these relationships. Then there's things like diversion can be a form of gaslighting. And this is a common one, pulling the conversation. It's like when they started getting to that surveillance state argument in Ashanti's case. Well, so if we're going to talk about me working late, why don't we talk about that time you did this? So the diversion means we pull the person back into this other kind of a space. This idea of triangulated communication. It seems like you're getting some weird ideas from your therapist or your friend or your family. So making other people who might actually be shoring the client up, pointing them out as a source of problems in the relationship. There's trivializing, which is a form of minimization, which falls under gaslighting. And then there's things like denial. I never said that. I never promised that. I'm going to get through two more, and then we're going to transition to a question. Memory doubting. That never happened. You have a terrible memory. Self-victimization. The narcissistic person says, I know. I'm a bad person. I'm a bad provider. I've been terrible this whole relationship. And then the need for the client often to step in and rescue is like, that's not what I'm saying. False empathy focused on a weakness. So what will happen is the gaslighter will say, gosh, I'm really worried about you. Are you okay? Like, you seem like you're a mess. And in fact, the person's not a mess, but now they're wondering, am I a mess? Or is that showing up in some way in my behavior, in my work, in my caregiving, anything? There's blame shifting, which is a form of gaslighting. This is because of you. This is because of my parents. This is because of someone out to get me. That blame shifting, that anything that's happening is the other person's fault, other person's responsibility. We'll also get into that when we talk about some of the domination patterns. I'm going to let us have our break here. So then it's exciting. After the break, you get to hear the next 4 aspects of gaslighting. So I think that's kind of fun. And were there any questions that we might be able to tackle here? Just one of them before we go to break?
Were there any questions? I think I'm on page 11 of a Word document, keeping track of all these questions, Dr. Ramani. So yes, there are questions. One of the most upvoted was, what is the best modality, meaning theory of counseling, do you believe works best for victims of narcissistic partners or parents?
I would say that the best mix to me personally, because I don't think we have a one modality that works best here, but based on the modalities we have out there, I would say the best approaches would be trauma-informed models are going to work great, especially for people with a narcissistic parent, because this actually really does result in, because the attachment disruptions and the reactivity and the loss of safety. Trauma-informed models, those of you who are working in EMDR, those of you who are working in somatic models, these work beautifully with these clients when used alongside psychoeducation. You still have to have that psychoeducational element. I would also say that acceptance and commitment work could work to a degree, but you have to be antagonism informed. It can't just be those elements without the understanding of how these relationships show up. Internal family systems could actually work here. The one model I would say be very, very, very careful with using are, believe it or not, cognitive behavioral models, which I'm sure so many of you are using, so many of us were trained on. And why? Change how you think is not going to be, it's not going to be that simple here, folks, because these clients have been working on how to change how they think for so long that I don't even know what they know what they're thinking anymore. So we want to steer away from, you have some power over your mind. These clients need a lot of psychoeducation about what's happening in these relationships. So again, it is a lot of the techniques, any of you working from genuine, well-trained, trauma-informed models. And I would say that a beautiful adjunct to this work is making sure that you do get trained very well, either working with complex trauma, working with a trauma-informed model. When you have that and you're comfortable with that in your wheelhouse and you couple that with the psychoeducation, I think together that becomes an excellent framework. My point of view here is that you want to be antagonism informed, because you can use whatever theoretical model you're using. Just again, move carefully with the CBT. It can work. You just have to be antagonism informed, which means is that this is not the usual rules of a relationship, and you have to have the awareness of these dynamics.
And I wanted to ask you to elaborate just a little bit on what you mean by psychoeducation, because I know that often we can kind of hear that word and think, oh, that's like the sort of the basics of like, how does therapy work, blah, blah, blah. But what you mean here with psychoeducation about narcissistic abuse is so much deeper than that. And having had the opportunity to consult with you on a case, I really understood how important that ended up being. Can you explain a little bit more what you mean by that in this context?
Yes. So psychoeducation is actually teaching clients in a very gentle way. You're not rolling up to them in the first session after they give you history and say, your mom's a narcissist, let's go. It's not that. It's very much that you are working with the client, almost laying out a map of what's happening in the relationship. You're really sort of like, you're seeing how the interactions are playing out. You yourself are sort of building up an evidence base where you can help them see what is unacceptable behavior, the consistency of it, how this links back to this person's personality style, the unyielding nature of personality, especially antagonistic personalities, how this has resulted in this pattern of self-blame. Exactly what we're talking about today, but at the client's level. Listen, I'll tell you what personally, I'm going to put myself out there. One of the most personally impactful elements of therapy I've experienced twice, once in couples work and once in individual work. In individual work was when my therapist said straight out, we've been working together for years. And she said, whoa, you were just gaslighted. It was the first time I ever heard the word. It was a long time ago. I was still in graduate school. And I said, what? And she said that to me. And it was like, that was where a light went on. But we had a strong rapport. We've been working together for a while. Another time was in couples therapy when I was being gaslighted in the session. And the therapist literally said, like, whoa, 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 buddy, you don't get to be judge and jury. She's having a feeling. And it was the aha moment, because it was the first time it had ever gotten called out. That's what I mean by psychoeducation. Real-time moments in the therapy where your client is sharing a dynamic, where you're validating something. And we're like, wasn't I being ridiculous when I said that? And you look at them and say, ridiculous. I can't believe you showed that much restraint. I'm a humanist. I'm a humanistically trained therapist. I bring Ramani into therapy. That's what I do. I'm not like, sharing my life with them in therapy, but I'm having genuine reactions to them. Even if you work psychoanalytically though, and actually Dan Shaw's work here is very, very, he's trained, dyed-in-the-wool analyst, that he is able to bring the psychoeducation to bear to the work, is to help people see how this works, what the pattern is, because ultimately the goal is twofold: to break the self-blame and help clients understand when behavior is unacceptable, even when they've come up with a justification and say, I hear the justification. I think it's wonderful. You're so empathic. However, this is not okay, because some of our clients literally don't know this is not okay. So that's and again, we get into that a lot in a module of this larger program. But those sort of the top notes, but it's a key element. So it's not just this is how therapy works. This is a lot deeper. It's education, honestly, about antagonism and how it affects us.
That's very helpful. We have just 1 minute, and I had a couple of questions in here about something you just mentioned, so I thought we would go there. About couples therapy, concerns that you have about people in narcissistic relationships being in couples therapy.
I have a lot of concerns. Now, here, listen, at the milder spectrum of narcissism, it's a bit of the adolescent annoyance stuff. There's a place for it, certainly. When you start getting to the moderate, to the severe, at the severe end, I actually think it's contraindicated, and it can be quite harmful. I really do. At the moderate level of couples work, you have to have one hell of an antagonism informed therapist in there. I actually did a consultation with someone recently, and it was clear that antagonistic patterns were showing up in both partners. You'll sometimes even see that, but it's being able to sort of tease out like what is being reacted to, all of that, because I think that the conventional training on couples work, which is maybe not implying absolutely equivalent responsibility, but that there's a lot of shared responsibility, actually really doesn't work when somebody's been indoctrinated. It's like trying to get someone out of a cult by saying you're partly responsible for getting into the cult. It doesn't work that way. So I think that with couples therapy, I do believe there's a place for antagonism informed couples therapy, but it means we need to rethink it. And I think that some of the more widely used forms of couples therapy, they actually don't build in the antagonism informed piece. It's presumptive. This isn't going to work with couples where there's a narcissist, but that's not advertised that way. So I do believe that if you do couples work, it is you can't get so caught in that communication and attunement are going to take care of everything, as much as you have to be mindful of what dynamics are showing up here. To be also, listen, we're human beings, to be aware of things like charm and charisma. It's not uncommon for the narcissistically abused partner to seem less engaged, more rattled, sometimes not as socially skilled, quite frankly. And the other partner may come in quite sophisticated, quite together, commenting on your office. Whoa, you went to school there? I have a friend who went to school. A friend of mine's on the faculty there. You might even see that kind of posturing behavior. We have to catch ourselves in our own fawn responses. We have to catch ourselves and be aware of our own histories when we're in the presence of especially the grandiose initial behaviors. So it's really about us trying to hear this entire dynamic cleanly and clearly, but not fall into the easy fallback. So, well, this is just communication, or what part are you responsible for? Or, you have to move very, very carefully. Here's the rub, folks. If you move too much into the emotional accountability work with the narcissistic partner, odds are 9 out of 10, they're going to drop out of therapy. And you know what? That's okay. Because I actually think for the narcissistically abused client, it is better for them to see that their partner dropped out of therapy when the heat was on. Then I've seen too many therapists say, but I just wanted to keep them in therapy. Well, you kept them in therapy by enabling the narcissistic partner. I don't think that's a win. It's okay if the narcissistic partner drops out. If anything, you might be able to put a bow on it, bring that partner in one more time, the one who's not narcissistic in most cases, and say, well, they did drop out. This work got much more intense. And so I think that those are the things you want to keep in mind. But I just was working recently, 2 weeks ago, did a consultation with someone who was trying to navigate a very, very difficult co-parenting situation with a narcissistic partner, actually about to be ex-partner, and literally got a bunch of education on horsemen and all this other stuff. And she came to me and she said, I was so confused by what happened to me. And I said, I would be too. And so she thought they were just educating me on this model of therapy. And we laid out the history. We're splitting up. And the therapist was saying, how can we help you get together? And she said, oh my gosh, it was so clear. All we were trying to do was navigate a co-parenting space. It's about listening. It's about being aware. It's about not always, the win is not always folks staying together. So if the narcissist drops out of therapy, not a bad thing. So it's a very long answer here. You just need to have, if you're going to refer, you have to have the strongest of strong referrals, and particularly people who are quite seasoned. This is something that where you have to feel like, I didn't have this earlier in my career, the confidence to be able to say, no, that's not happening in here. We're not doing that in here. And to have that kind of oomph behind your voice, which helps to understand antagonism to do that. So those are my thoughts there. But when it comes to the severe narcissistic abuse, I say, actually, it's fully contraindicated.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So we will go ahead and take a break and come back at 1:15. So let's do 11 minutes.